Hello, this is Jennifer Hancock, Jen the Humanist, and it's February 2016, which means it's Black History Month. Yay! And the Florida State Park System put out an email which gave us a link to the Black Heritage Trail brochure, which lists all the sites in Florida that you can learn about Black history in Florida, which is great. They have the Illusory Battlefield. They have all sorts of things in there. It's really cool. Zora Neale Hurston's birthplace, things like that. What they didn't include was the Gamble Plantation, which is a state park. It's 3 blocks from my house. And as you can probably tell by the name Plantation, it did have slaves. It was a sugar plantation. It was founded with about 100 slaves. At its height, it had about 200 slaves. When emancipation came, they were down to 60-some slaves. The thing about the Gamble Plantation, though, is that it's also the Judah P. Benjamin Memorial Site, and he was a Civil War Confederate general. He holed up here for a while trying to escape the Union Army because he was going to be arrested. And it's kind of, when you go to the site, it's absolutely beautiful. It's a plantation. It's beautiful. But there's really no mention of the slaveries and the slaves that were at the site at the Gamble Plantation. It's like they're kind of not mentioned at all, which is kind of odd because you can't really run a sugar plantation without labor. And they don't talk about the labor much at all. And so I went online on Twitter and I tweeted to the Florida Park System, and I said the hashtag was ask about the slaves, because I think, especially white people like me, we need to ask about the slaves, because I don't think, especially with the Gamble Plantation in particular, you can't understand the Seminole Indian Wars, you can't understand the Civil War, and you can't understand settlement unless you understand slavery, right? Because if you're in my county and you look at demographics, we have literally a narrow strip of land north of the river, which is where I am, or where the Gamble Plantation is, that's black, where black people live. Like, why are they all on this narrow strip of land? Well, part of it's redlining, but part of it's what happened after emancipation and after the slaves were emancipated from the plantations in the area. And they had to be given land. And they were. And so we have to ask about the slaves. History in Florida makes no sense unless you ask about the slaves. That's just all there is to it. You can't understand the ranchos and why they were shut out of business by the U.S. government. You can't understand how that relates to the Seminole Indian Wars. You can't even understand the Seminole Indian Wars unless you understand that runaway slaves were joining the Seminoles. Why did the plantation owners care about the Indians? It wasn't exactly about the land. It was about slavery and about the fact that their slaves were running away to join the Seminoles. Suddenly we got to get rid of the Seminoles. And if we got to get rid of the Seminoles, we have to get rid of the fishing camps. Even though the fishing camps had nothing to do with the Seminoles. They were run primarily by Spanish Indians. But they also included escaped slaves in a cooperative ownership model as opposed to a plantation ownership model. So there were alternate economic systems going on here. There were people opposed to slavery here. And I don't think you can understand the history unless you understand the slavery. And we do ourselves a disservice by erasing slavery from the history. You go to crackercountry.org, which is a living history museum about the settlers, about the white settlers. And they do have information about blacks in Florida. What's interesting about it is black history starts after emancipation, as if they just kind of showed up. Right? And when you read the history of my county, blacks are only mentioned as numbers, as owned slaves, the number of owned slaves on the different plantations in the area. And as soon as emancipation occurs, they're erased from the record. They're not considered voting people. They're just not worth mentioning anymore because they're not property anymore, so they're not mentioned anymore. We need to ask about the slaves. So I created the hashtag Ask About the Slaves so that we can ask about the slaves. So if you live anywhere in the South, anywhere where there's a park that has a plantation, where there used to be slaves, especially an important one like the Gamble Plantation, which definitely had slaves, 200 some at some point, and it was active in the Civil War and the Seminole Indian Wars. We have a fort, Fort Hammer. It was a Seminole Indian War fort in our area. All of this is all tied to slavery. All of this history is all tied to slavery. So we have to ask about the slavery, because I am sick and tired of Southerners telling me that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery when it so clearly had everything to do with slavery. So let's ask about the slaves. Hashtag ask about the slaves.